Do you know what time it is? It's Supernatural Storytime. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. A bad day at the office. So I got into work today, and the atmosphere is extremely weird. Not just the way people are acting and feeling either. The actual air and weather is going odd. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I got up with a massive headache and the sound of rain beating down on the windows. I figured it was allergies from the season and the rain. The rain is a lot harder than usual for this time of year. But it had been pretty rainy lately, so I didn't think too much of it, aside from the fact it was going to suck to walk in it. But I needed the hour, so I said, tough shit, and got up and got ready. I rushed to the bus to the downpour. Didn't even bother with the umbrella. The wind was so bad. Just pulled on my raincoat hood and then closed it and booked it the whole way. I noticed a few crows flying overhead. I'd never seen a bird flying in the rain, so that threw me off a little. I swear, it looked like they were following me, high above. I didn't really take too long to investigate. When you've got buckets of heavy rain coming down on you, though, you don't take time to look straight up. I was alone on the bus ride there, which I normally prefer, listening to my MP3 player and not be bothered by a crazy or homeless person. But this morning, it was different. The darkness and the rain made me feel paranoid and distant on the bus. I felt like an animal in a cage for transport, being shipped off to slaughter. But I do like to talk a little before work, and I was just trying to ignore the feeling. When I got to work, the feeling of anxiousness and slight dread only got worse. And it didn't seem like I was the only one. When you work at a call center, it's not uncommon for the employees to be a little depressed sometimes. 'Tis the nature of the work. But this was much worse. Everyone was grim and talking to no one. It was like walking into some old world monastery where everyone was getting ready to whip themselves for their own sins. Then the crows returned with a vengeance. They perched by the dozens, maybe hundreds, on the fences and telephone wires all around the building. They all just kept staring into the windows. Their heads didn't move and bobbed like most birds. They just stared. Then the supervisor started making their rounds. Okay, something is obviously not right with things here. About 10 minutes ago, the rain started to kick into high gear, beating against the windows like an angry drunk person locked out of their own home. The birds started to become agitated, breaking their creepy statue-like appearance. They started to fly at the windows. The first one made one of the girls scream, and I'd seen birds do that before. It's usually pretty funny to my sick sense of humor. Maybe I would have laughed this time if more hadn't started dive-bombing the windows. A few more people flipped. Even one of the guys here, he freaked out a little. Finally, about after 5 long minutes of birds scaring the hell out of us, they stopped. And every single one of them flew up and out of sight. Seeing hundreds of crows fly through the rain is an awesome and terrifying sight. It gave me goosebumps. The few reps that were here started to leave early. I can't blame them. Most of us were ready to go from the shock and that odd onset of depression. But the few of us that didn't care about rain or weird events stayed. In my case, it was needing the money and the hours, so like a desperate jackass, I stayed. God, I wish I had left. About 30 minutes later, it got so much worse. We had an applicant come in. We get them all the time. It is a call center after all. They sit up by the front desk and wait to get their test and interview. I went to have lunch and I saw him. Tall and gangly thin, wearing a wet black trench coat. He had ratty long black hair that was also soaking wet. I couldn't see much of his face under his hair, but I could tell he had a creepy grin. I had to wonder how a weirdo like that landed an interview. But I blew it off and sat down. Didn't take me long to realize how uncomfortable I was eating lunch there. The lunchroom was separated by a row of windows from the waiting area. And tall, dark, and freaky wouldn't stop staring at me through his eyebrows and disgusting hair. Completely ruined my appetite. I sat there, doing my best to ignore him. finally got called into his interview. I quickly wolfed down my chicken leg and leftovers. I went back to my desk, and that was 20 minutes ago. He's still back there with HR. They don't usually take this long, especially when we all know they're not getting hired. It's really making me nervous. What if he actually got hired? I'd hate to have to work with fucking Jack Skellington on heroin. Anyway. Oh God. This is unreal. Okay. So I'm here now, watching a fucking disaster unfold in front of me. The tall man finally came out, but not with a job, but a hostage. He held our poor little HR girl by the back of the neck with some kind of fancy dagger to her throat. It actually looked like it was a bird's wing. I actually appreciated the design of it before I snapped into reality and saw a glimmer of red on her neck and the blade. The man had a maniacal smile through his giant grin. He called out in what I thought was Spanish. It immediately made my hair stand up on the back of my neck. Something about the words, it made me shiver. Someone whispered to me that it was Latin. We all shot up and looked over. I heard someone scream when they must have realized what they were seeing. I just froze in place, contemplating fight or flight. Within a few seconds, one of those options was taken from us all. Just as we were all accepting what we were witnessing, the crows returned. They passed by the windows in such a quick and solid mass it looked like our building was caught in a tornado of raven feathers. I'd never seen anything like it. One of the reps near me slowly pulled his phone out and started dialing it at his side. He only pushed 3 digits, then sent. I knew what was happening. Smart move. Then the gangly man's Latin started getting louder. All of a sudden, the worst, loudest buzzing sound began to scream from his phone and every headset in the building. I had mine hanging around my neck, and the noise was so loud and awful I ripped the headphones away immediately. Somehow the bastard had done something to the phones. All of a sudden the Latin stopped, and he spoke what passed for English. Sit down. Heads down. Oh, little pretty one bleeds, he said in an odd and snake-like accent. We all just did what he said. I thought about what I might be able to do with my little Kershaw pocket knife. Just as I palmed it in my back pocket, the gangly man turned to me with his beady eyes and his toothy grin. I pulled my hand out of my pocket and sat down. I tried the phone again, but that same awful noise rang in my ear. Somehow I'm still able to get on the internet, but with all the blockers up, I can't download Skype or any other messenger. Or get on Facebook even. Somehow, I don't know now what to do. I'm just typing, keeping my head low. Shit, he's coming this way. I don't understand. I don't know what's going on, or how any of this is happening. Fuck, I'm so scared right now. He walked around the office, holding the HR girl and dragging her by the neck. She was in pain and crying the whole time. Through all the fear and insanity, I remember feeling like such a piece of shit for not remembering her name. He walked by everyone at a feverish pace, stopping at me on his second pass through. I started to break into a cold sweat as he leaned to stare at me. The HR girl was pushed down to her knees as he grinned at me with his yellow teeth and tiny pupils. I couldn't help but keep eye contact with those beady eyes as they darted around, but never stopped staring into mine. Then he quickly shifted to Lee's face at the desk next to me. He pulled the knife away from her throat and offered it to Lee. Lee looked at him with fear and confusion. The HR girl immediately began to understand the situation, and I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Take it. Don't you want to save her? The gangly man hissed at Lee. Lee was clearly shaken, but he was a big guy. He stared a minute longer, and the gangly man shoved the knife into his hands. It nearly cut him. He hesitated for just a moment, then he stabbed the gangly man. He stuck the crow dagger right into the gangly man's heart, just smiled at him. Lee's eyes were wide as he pulled the knife out and stabbed him again and again and again in a flurry. The gangly man began to laugh and drool like a hyena. Lee stumbled backwards in confusion. That's when the blood started seeping through his shirt. He collapsed to his knees, then smashed his face into the floor. The blood started to pool quickly. I wanted to pass out. The gangly man slowly stopped laughing and picked the knife back up. He was fine, aside from some rips in his old wet coat. He turned to stare at me again, his smelly breath drifting over as he spoke. Write it. Go ahead and write it all down. Let them know, he said as he turned to my computer. I closed the screen long before he'd made it to my section of the office, so I don't know how he knew I'd been typing everything that was going on. He smiled at me again and then turned and took the HR girl back down the hall. He started laughing and speaking Latin again, and he's been pacing up and down the aisle, doing that for 10 minutes. I don't know what to do, aside from writing it all. What the fuck should I do? Something best forgotten. Hey guys, I found this report in a thumb drive. One of the executives in my company absent-mindedly left it in my office. It's probably confidential, but what a strange and extraordinary read. The monolith. That thing which the sea spat out in their fury at a world entirely unprepared to acknowledge its existence. If there is any mercy left to be found in the world, may I be the last to write of it. For almost 2 decades, I have been working with Caritas, the Roman Catholic Church's aid organization. I offer counseling services to the grief-stricken and calamity-hit and war-torn places. It has taken me to scenes of unimaginable disasters where the toll of human lives could scarcely be comprehended. I am a believer, despite my frequent encounters with these catastrophes. Up to now, I cannot sufficiently explain why this is so on an intellectual level. Perhaps I've always been impressed by the human capacity for hope, even in the bleakest situations, when it seems the only alternative is to hope and pray with one's guts, an illogical optimism against the realpolitik and savagery of life. It came to my attention in Thailand, days after the Great Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 that left hundreds of thousands dead. We landed in the middle of total chaos. The tropical heat had pushed my many Western companions to their limits, and it did not help that infrastructure and order had dissolved into a state of total putrefaction. Thousands of the dead littered the streets in scenes of unspeakable horror and sadness. It would take many weeks before a semblance of working order, a sort of subsistence modus vivendi, would be established and the aid agencies properly coordinate with the government, the UN, and others. In the 3rd week of January, I was asked to see a young girl, delirious, raving, on the point of lunacy. She was 13 years old and had lost her entire extended family to the tsunami, and their bodies were never recovered. The girl would not give us her name. We called her Molly, after the daughter of one of the doctors with us, and she would alternate between violent hysterics and absolute calm and terrifying precision. I remarked back then that her case was certainly unusual. It was unlike any case of PTSD I had encountered before, and the shifts in her mood were always dependent on the time of the day. From the moment she would awaken, she was seized by violent fits. It came to a point that she had to be restrained, but even our retainers chafed at the strength of this girl. But as soon as the clock struck 6, she would immediately fall into a trance-like state and observe a silence and austerity that most monasteries would envy. What caused these shifts? A week later, I observed the first deviation from the usual behavior exhibited by Molly. I was writing a report on my computer when I felt a tug on my shirt. It was Molly, wide-eyed and calm at the wrong time of day. She handed me a piece of paper with a drawing on it, something rectangular and solid, perhaps a skyscraper, I thought then. Then the tugging grew stronger, and instinct told me she wanted me to follow her outside. We ran as fast as we could, she darting through the maze of tents and personnel with purposeful action, I straining to be the best of my ability. Then she hopped onto the back of a truck bound for the beach. I was very hesitant about following, but this could be the chance to unravel the enigma behind Molly. We arrived at the beach an hour later, no thanks to the damaged infrastructure. We walked for a bit. I estimated close to 800 meters before I finally stopped at a curious sight. It was a slab of black stone, smooth as glass, elegant, and perfectly cut. A group of curious onlookers had gathered around it. I estimate it was about 9 feet high and 3 feet across. My gut told me it was military, but was it? We approached cautiously. I could sense that the others looked at me as the Johnny-come-lately, out to propose an outdated hypothesis, which they had already debunked, hypothetically, of course. Molly took my hand and led me closer. She put my hand on the surface of the slab. Stone indeed it was, but never in my life had I held stone so warm, almost as if it were pulsating. A man who'd been there before me looked me in the eye. He too had a child with him, and he now pulled out a coin from his pocket, as if he were going to demonstrate something fanciful and cheap. Then he placed the coin on its side against the face of the slab, let it go, and in horrific astonishment, I watched as the coin suddenly raced up the face of the slab. It was then that I noticed that every adult in that circle had brought a child along. There were no discussions. I called to Molly and we immediately returned to our base. She looked longingly and lustfully at the slab one last time before she turned, and we started the long journey home. The next day I was greeted with the news that Molly had disappeared. We looked everywhere for her, but our worst fear had come true. She was truly gone. One of the guards later informed us that she saw Molly hitching a ride on a truck bound for the beach. He said he'd heard her singing in Thai that she was going to see her family again. We questioned the driver upon his return, but he swore that he never saw the girl. That was the last time any of us ever saw her. On the night of her disappearance, I dreamt I was standing on a cliff, overlooking a vast and empty beach. It was dark and empty and utterly desolate. Below I saw Molly. I shouted at her, screamed her name, but the only acknowledgement I received was an enigmatic smile. Then she turned and walked into the sea. "Come and join me," she said. "We will see my parents again. You will drown. I will not. The great ruler of the sea will never allow it." And she walked on, until at least the crown of head disappeared into the black waves. In 2013, I returned to Southeast Asia after an almost decade-long hiatus. Super Typhoon Haiyan had unleashed unspeakable devastation upon the port city of Tacloban in the Philippines, lashing out with 350-kilometer-per-hour winds and bringing down torrential waters. The scenes of destruction were the worst the world had seen since the Boxing Day tsunami. The winds were such that a freighter was pushed from the seaboard onto the town. Countless homes were destroyed, roofs had been torn and blown out, and storm surges unleashed the fury of the foaming sea into streets and alleyways, drowning thousands in the process. 7,000 people died. The local economy was in ruins, and political squabbling was on the rise. Haiyan was deeply personal for me. I was born in Manila, but our family had migrated to the States when I was 7 years old. I did not expect, however, that my reacquaintance with my country of birth was to take place under such abominable circumstances. Although Tacloban was hardest hit, our unit was deployed to Guyana, further east. I found myself playing counselor again. I had help in the person of Flora, an aspirant to the religious life, who came from an upper-class family. Flora was only 18, but had desired to enter the convent for as long as she could remember. She had an infectious zeal and optimism which energized our team on even the most trying days. One time, when our team was shown the Church of the Immaculate Conception, one of the oldest and most priceless Baroque jewels in the country, and which had been smashed beyond recognition by the wind and rain, she casually remarked, "We'll build it again, bigger this time." It was thus a surprise when I saw her in a state of total stillness one beautiful Friday morning. She sat huddled and shuddering in one corner of our camp, where she was wont to do when she prayed her rosary, but she only gripped the beads, and the metal was sinking themselves into the soft flesh of her palm. I could tell she was seized by terror of something, perhaps trauma, but what caused it, and why so late? That evening I heard a loud piercing scream that shook everyone awake. Maniacal laughter followed in its wake, followed by more screaming, unearthly, blood-curdling, the kind that put impossible strain on your vocal cords. I was not surprised to find Flora at all, but the state of her appearance unnerved me. Her eyes were bloodshot, her mouth was foaming, and the veins in her neck bulged out. Don't let it take me, she shouted again and again in Bisaya. Then she knelt down and stretched her arms in the gesture of a cross. Oh my God, have mercy on the whole world. One of the orderlies approached Florida and sedated her. After a while she grew still again, but her eyes remained open and alert. Then she shuddered violently and ran out. I had never seen anyone run with such purpose and furiosity before. She pushed aside barriers and personnel and barreled through stocks of equipment and medical supplies in a rush to her nameless destination. We followed suit. It was 3:30 in the morning, and the wind was unusually cold. Flora was still running with incredible energy. She had done so for 6 kilometers now, and she had barely sputtered. Then at last we found ourselves by the port, and in the distance I saw it, a solid shape of obsidian darkness, even in the glowing night, a shard of sacrilege spat straight out of hell to mock the frailty of the human mind with its perfection and inscrutability. The slab. I shone a light ahead and saw that Flora had finally collapsed some feet away from it, a writhing mass of quivering, blasted flesh. In fear and trembling, we alighted from the vehicle and approached Flora. Her flesh was clammy, and a white-hot fever had taken hold of her. Suddenly, the painful memory of Thailand came rushing back to me. Molly's disappearance had left me broken and haunted, and had taken me years to reel from the alcoholism that I developed as a result. We took Flora back and hopped on the car. We drove as fast as we could back to base and tended to her. I dreamt I was observing a great city of our age, nameless, heroic, and corrupt, from a great height. It was bathed in total darkness, aside from a river of faint light that lit it from below. Then I saw a shape, or a shadow of a shape, shuffling among the shadows. To say its size was titanic would be an understatement, for the thing dwarfed the city completely, and its every moment groaned with the weight of age. Instinctively I knew it was a human shape, or at least a sacrilege of a human shape, and then I did not dare look up at its face, lest I risk my complete descent into insanity. I woke up 12 hours later. There was Flora's face staring directly at me with the most incredible intensity I'd ever seen. I know you've seen him too, she whispered, and he is coming back soon. I asked her who was coming back, but before her lips could part an answer, she swooned away and died. Know that I have tried everything in my power to find out more about this slab. I think I may have found a good lead, but this will occasion lots of travel and complete dedication. I only hope you will never have to countenance this abomination in your lifetime. The darkness inside. For a little while now, my friends and I have decided that it would be a smart idea to explore abandoned buildings and record our findings. Together we've explored old abandoned houses, a couple of Civil War cemeteries, a mall, and even a broken down gas station. Nothing spectacular at all, but we did get some good footage pranking each other and pretty much having fun. After a few crappy videos and one very close police encounter, my friends grew bored of urban archaeology and went off to do their own things. I, on the other hand, decided to keep up the urban exploration and see what was out there. My interest didn't last long. It was huge. Probably one of the biggest buildings I was about to explore, and it was all mine. I let my friends know where I was going and told them I would message them when I was about to go in and when I left the building. I told them that if they didn't hear from me by sundown, call the police and let them know where I was. The building was a very old monastery used by the church to house orphans and to provide education for monks from different countries who wanted to come stateside to share their faith. It was built between the winter of 1918 and the early fall of 1919. Its doors opened Christmas Day 1919, and around 1932 the monastery officially became abbey. This was all information I dug up at the local library, and other than the information I provided, I'm not really the history buff. More of an explorer. I packed a lunch and 2 bottles of water along with my camera, gloves, LED flashlight, and a face mask to filter out anything potentially dangerous in the air. The monastery was about 2 hours away from where I lived, and unfortunately I had to park at a commuter lot, which was about 1/8 of a mile walk until I reached the monastery property. The property was overgrown and unkempt with multiple smaller buildings, which had either collapsed or were about to collapse. There was litter all over the property. The monastery was a huge brick building covered with vines and moss, making it look as if it was being reclaimed by nature, albeit very slowly. The front of the building had hundreds of windows, either painted black or shattered to bits. No trespassing signs were lazily propped against the building, as if someone was about to put them up, but gave up instantly. Most of the doors were blocked off by chains or nailed shut, but there was a window on the first floor that was smashed open that I could probably reach if I stood on something and hauled my fat ass up and over the sill. But before that, I sent out my group text to let them know I was entering the building and that my phone would be off to conserve the battery unless I either got into trouble or I was leaving the building. After I made sure my text was sent, I found a large metal bucket among the junk strewn around the property, placed it underneath the open first floor window, turned my phone off, and climbed into the darkness. I would like to say I entered the building like a pro, but I'd be lying. I fell flat on my ass right into a pile of broken glass. Luckily, none of the glass shards made their way into me, and I slowly got up and brushed myself off. The hallway was dark, with only a little bit of light creeping in through the crack of the wood sealing the windows shut. I reached into my pack and grabbed my flashlight and my mask. Safety first, I muttered to myself as I placed the cheap Home Depot mask over my nose and mouth, restricting my breathing and making me sound like a half-assed Darth Vader. I aimed my flashlight down the hallway and switched it on. Dust particles and cobwebs danced in the light, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and I caught myself thinking about the Haunted Mansion ride at Disney World. I decided to start my little adventure on the third floor and work my way to the basement. The third floor had multiple rooms with nothing in them at all, or just empty bed frames. There were obviously rooms for either the students that attended classes here or the orphans that lived here. Not surprisingly, the third and second floor were pretty much the same, dusty and empty, with no signs of any life that had once populated the halls. It was kind of disappointing in a way. I guess I was hoping for some religious mystery to jump out at me and tell me a story of someone's past life. The first floor was a little more interesting, providing me with at least some better pictures. The first floor housed multiple classrooms and studying areas, as well as a large cafeteria, a gym, a library which smelled of mold and decaying books, and a large church which had doors that were surprisingly nailed shut. I glanced at my watch and noted that it was nearly noon, and I had been exploring the building for nearly 2 hours now, and I had not come across one locked door up until I reached this area. The church's entrance was a set of red painted doors nailed shut with something painted on each door. I got closer to the doors and examined them with my flashlight. Each door had a set of the same words painted on them in black paint. They didn't look like English, but I will spell them out as best I can. Intus, Tenebras, Intus Tenebras. If I had known what it had said, I would never have broken open those doors and walked into that church. I would have gotten the hell out of there. I had to do a language search, and it came back as Latin. Those words written in black paint on those 2 doors read, "Inside the dark." Or you could translate it as "darkness inside." Of course, if I had known this, I wouldn't have kept going, but since my phone was off, and I felt it was probably just some religious nut's mysterious handwriting, I proceeded to break open the church's set of doors and walk in. The room was big, far bigger than what I would have expected. The monastery was huge itself, but this one worship room, or church, was at least the entire height of the building, with multiple rows of pews leading up to the center of the room, which surrounded a large stone altar. The room was decaying, and every step I took I could feel the floor give a little under my weight. The last thing I needed was to fall through the floor into the basement. I slowly made my way to the center of the room, shining my flashlight down each pew, making sure nothing was crouched, ready to jump out at me. "Just dust and more dust," I muttered to myself. The altar was about as big as a person and almost level with my stomach. There was nothing spectacular about the altar but these small grooves on all 4 sides of the marble top. Each groove ended at a hole into what seemed to disappear into the altar itself. On top of the altar was an old dusty leather-bound book. The book had no title, just a leather strap holding it closed. I unbuckled the strap and opened the book to the first page, where once again it was in a language I couldn't read. Infra sumos diorum satan didimos nos tibi nomen atrenum. I didn't even want to translate it. It was obvious what it was about. I flipped through the pages, but I couldn't understand the pictures or the writings. None of it made sense to me, and none of it should be in a church. The pictures were sickening, illustrating ritualistic death and murder, depicting men being slaughtered, women being raped, and children being sacrificed. I couldn't look at any more pages, so I closed the book and decided that I had enough. I began walking back towards the door when I heard a soft voice behind me. Ego sum liber. I wheeled around to see a rather tall man standing by the altar. He was well dressed, seemed to be in his early 40s, and he had an almost fatherly look about him. The room seemed brighter now, as if the sun was shining through the windows of the church, except the church windows inside his monastery were boarded up and there was no other way to bring in the light. Who are you?" I asked. The man chuckled and placed his hand on the dusty book that lay on the altar. "You speak the tongue of my captors. How quaint." He spoke in that soft, soothing voice. "I am many things. I have many names. Some you have probably heard, and others that would seem foreign to you. I've been here for a long time, and you, my son, have set me free." The man opened the book and flipped through the pages, chuckling as he did. "So many lives taken to keep me here. So much blood spilled. So much effort, all for nothing. Buildings crumble, and the binds that hold us break." He snapped shut the book and looked up at me. This was the first time I got to see into his eyes. They were completely white. I was frozen in place and I didn't know what to do. This man, this thing was right in front of me and I had nowhere to run to. The man, if you could call him that, continued to speak. "What holds your tongue, child? Am I that frightening?" he asked with a chuckle. It took me a moment to find my voice. "Are you the devil?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. They felt thick in my throat like cold maple syrup. The man laughed and the walls began to tremble as he did. I felt a deep fear creep through me, giving me chills. The devil? Oh, my son. Those are stories written by pathetic men trying to comprehend a world too vast and diverse to understand. I didn't notice it at first, but the man had gotten closer, much closer. He was now only a few feet from me and I could smell him now. He smelled of old dry leaves on an autumn day. He smelled of the earth. He was now standing right in front of me. He placed one long hand on my shoulder and smiled. His teeth were long, sharp, and as white as bleached bone. "It doesn't matter who I am," he continued to smile. His touch was so cold. "How did I free you?" I asked, shivering as the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. "Blood seals are temporary bandages. My monk friends thought this building and its inhabitants would last much longer than it did. As the building began to crumble, so did the seal. You and your little adventurous soul kind of hurried it up a little, and I thank you." "How come nobody found you before?" I asked. The room was so dark now that I couldn't see the man anymore, but I could sense his presence. I could feel his breath and his cold, deathly touch. They weren't looking for anything when they stumbled into this place. Just the quick excitement exploring something forgotten by society. You, on the other hand, were looking for something adventurous, something mysterious. You found something. I don't remember anything after that. I remember waking up in my own bed with a horrible headache. I got up, grabbed my phone from my pants, and switched it on. After the phone booted up, my phone began chiming almost relentlessly. I had 45 text messages and 16 voicemails. They were all asking me where I had been, if I was okay, where was I? I dialed my closest friend Jim. It rang only once before he answered. "Where the fuck were you, dude?" Jim asked frantically. "I told you guys I was going to the monastery," I replied. There was silence on the other end for a moment before Jim spoke up again. "Pro, you were gone for 3 days. We had everyone looking for you, the cops, your parents, and even some of the town. We found your car and had it towed to your parents' place. Where the—" I hung up the phone and ignored it, as it began ringing again. I was confused and scared, and I didn't know what to do. It's been about a month since this whole thing happened. I'm writing this as a bit of therapy to help me figure out what happened to those 3 days of missing time and to make sure it stays fresh in my mind. I haven't been to any more abandoned places since, and my parents have been keeping pretty close tabs on me. I'll be honest, I have a very strange feeling that something is going to happen soon, if it hasn't already. I can even hear that chuckle and see those white eyes that accompany that chuckle.